So I'll state my bias up front. Uh, in my opinion, weighing the benefits of a market-based capitalist system versus the drawbacks, I just look at all the historical examples. The standard of living does tend to favor the market-based societies. The level of innovation, the level of personal liberty that exists in these places is also much higher. So that is my bias. But I'm also going to be very honest about the drawbacks of these systems, at least from the ones I can see. Because again, as economists, we should be thinking about the cost and benefit of all the decisions we make. And so it's only fair to go through the drawbacks. Again, my bias is that the benefits of our system and the market-based system outweigh the drawbacks, but it's still to be seen. It's maybe early to determine over the long run if these drawbacks do um, outweigh the benefits. And I mentioned in one of the previous videos about the fertility rate in South Korea. Uh, you know, Even if they have this very wealthy society that has a very high standard of material comfort, if they're not able to sustain their society by producing enough people, then you could argue that it's a failed society. That system is a failure because it can't do the most basic function of a society, which is to perpetuate the culture and the people. With that being said, let's talk about some of the drawbacks. And I think in South Korea, maybe some of these drawbacks, you can argue are part of this fertility problem. So let's discuss them. So, race to the bottom. Okay, so when you have firms and individuals who are very competitive for a market, uh, they may tend to do things which are not in the best interest of kind of people in society because they're trying to compete against each other. Okay, so some examples of this are working conditions. Okay, so if you have a bunch of firms competing for in the steel market, for example, if one decides, hey, I can produce my steel for a little less by not giving my workers safe conditions, giving them equipment, using methods of production which are more dangerous to my workers. I'm going to do that because I want to win and I want to be able to produce my steel for the lowest price and outsell my competitors. Now, in order to compete with that firm, the other firms in the market will have to maybe start adopting those same methods. And as this continues, you have a degradation in kind of the working conditions, in this case, in this example, for all the firms in the whole market. The same race to the bottom could be applied to environmental impact. So maybe for dealing with pollution, one firm in a market, like a chemical producer, may decide that they are going to not adhere to all the environmental standards, or maybe there are no environmental standards in the jurisdiction they're in, or let's say they're in a jurisdiction that has a lot of environmental regulation. They may move their production to another country or another jurisdiction that doesn't, which will force all the competitors to do the same to stay competitive. So, this is another example of race to the bottom. Corruption and cheating. Okay, so if one firm is uh, willing to bribe or corrupt the system in some way, maybe bribing a government official to get a contract, whatever it is, the other competitors, in order to compete, will be kind of compelled to do the same thing. So this is what it's called a race to the bottom because everyone is trying to outcompete each other and is willing to win at all costs. Uh, the example that I think of recently is cobalt mining in the Congo. Uh, the working conditions there are, uh, from what is described by a journalist that I listened to on a podcast, horrid. And it's basically because there's the firms are competing with each other, And I would largely say that the government is not really intervening. I think it's hard to argue for a zero regulation kind of state where there's no regulation. I think you have these race to the bottom problems that become very bad for society without government intervention. And you can argue that in the Congo, there's basically no enforcement of working condition standards by the government. So firms there that are involved in mining just take advantage of that and have literally raced to the bottom in terms of giving their workers basically no safety equipment and protection against this very dangerous job. Okay, tragedy of the commons. This is another common one. This is where um, individuals acting in their self-interest deplete a common resource, okay, leading to a long-term competitive loss, or sorry, a long-term collective loss. So the classic example of this is grazing. So if you have shared kind of publicly owned grazing areas and people bring their cows or goats or whatever to graze there, if everyone limited the amount of grazing and limited their herd size, then that grazing area could be used by everybody. But if you have self-interested people using that commons, um, then eventually one is if there's one person that's going to overgraze and take more than their fair share, that's going to incentivize everyone to. It's a cooperation problem. You can argue that uh, private ownership is a solution to this, in that if someone owned that pasture, then they would preserve it and not have it overgrazed. So that is, one kind of argument for private ownership, but you can't do that with everything. Like air pollution is an example. No one owns like all the air above a society. So if one firm starts polluting a lot and producing, producing in a cheaper manner, maybe using a more uh, less environmentally friendly production method, then everyone will, and the air is going to kind of um, be a victim of that we all share. It could also be argued that if we had a justice system that allowed individuals who were nuisanced by some kind of pollution of the commons to be able to sue the firm, then that would be baked into the kind of decision making of the firm, where since they know that they could be sued for kind of ruining a common resource, that they just will figure out a way to mitigate that. So again, this is not always the case. Our judicial system is not perfect, and it's not easy to bring a lawsuit against, like, for example, an oil company because they're going to be resourced far better than an individual. Um, so this tragedy of the commons is also oftentimes falls in the purview of government regulation and the government stepping in and trying to do something. Now, the question is the government overstepping? You can argue that in many cases it does, and it's to the detriment of the economy as a whole. Okay, the cost of externalities. This is kind of related to the tragedy of commons. Externalities are basically costs or benefits of economic activities that are not reflected in the market price. Okay, so pollution is a big example of this, where um, uh, the price of pollution is not necessarily baked into the price of the good or service, because the firm doesn't have to really pay for that pollution that they generate. um, Habitat destruction. This is another one. So basically, um, you have these externalities. Usually, they're costs, uh, and they're not really priced in, and um, the public is going to have to bear the long term repercussions. The another example of this is like the use of irreplaceable assets as if they're like kind of just short term. Like oil, you can argue takes millions and millions of years to make from natural processes at least, and we are using that resource up very quickly. Now, is that the most efficient use of those resources? It depends on how you kind of judge the kind of um, like maybe the use of oil is going to lead to other forms of energy like nuclear, and this is kind of like a bridge energy source. Um, but it depends. Some resources like you can also argue like for agriculture, phosphorus. There's certain minerals that are mined that are very difficult to replace, and once they're mined up, it's going to be very difficult to come up with a replacement. And so, using them judiciously now might be better. Yeah, there's going to be an external cost to this use now to future generations. Okay, human sense of fairness and justice. So there are many studies. For example, people tend to be happier making $60,000 a year if everyone around them is making 50, rather than getting paid 70 while everyone around them is making 80. Okay, so there's human beings psychologically are anchoring to the people around them. Okay, so when you have a society that has a very high average standard of living, like let's say America, where Americans live, even a poor American has a TV, a cell phone, running water, um, a lot of things that people around the world still don't have in modern kind of in the modern world. Yet they see the billionaires who are much much wealthier than them, and there's kind of like an anchoring problem where they're seeing this huge disparity between them and these other people in their same society. Now, they're not looking at their absolute condition, which is pretty good. They're looking at their relative condition. So, now, is this good or bad, rational, irrational? Um, that's a philosophical question. But just in terms of like stability of a society and humans kind of enacting changes, uh, people don't like that. These big gaps between members of society. There's another experiment where um, one person is given $100 and they make an offer to another person to split that. And if the person rejects it, then neither of them get the money. So the person with the $100, they want to make it fair so that the other person doesn't kind of just veto the whole thing. Now, in a purely rational standpoint, even if the person with the $100 offered the other person $1, okay, they should both accept it because that person wouldn't have gotten the $1 in the first place. So it's like free money for that person. But human beings, if the other person knows that the person has 100, they don't make them a fair offer, at least like let's say $30 or something, then they would just reject it. Just neither of them would get the money. So human beings do have this innate sense of like fairness, and so that's oftentimes in market capitalist societies. There's big gaps of disparity between people, and so that has an impact on kind of the stability of society. Markets can be manipulated, so especially in non-competitive markets. So the perfect market that we discussed is rare. So uh, in the real world, even market capitalist economies tend to open up the possibility of market manipulation. So they're not perfect. Um, the materialist worldview. Okay, so human happiness is not just baked into material comfort and our material standard of living. So the market capitalist system, when we talked about Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations, how much goods and services are produced by society. That's a very narrow framing of what humans need. Okay, so uh, you can argue that that there are many extremely depressed, sad, and miserable billionaires. Okay, so their material standard is very good, very high, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily happy. So if a society is thinking about the overall well-being of their people, then pure market capitalist system may not be the best, uh, the most ideal to achieve these other ends. Um, it could be that the a market system leads to the stifling of innovation and risk taking. Okay, so especially when large firms start dominating, so you can argue that the tech sector is dominated by Facebook, Google. Very few firms have a very large kind of control of internet technology. and that fact may stifle innovation. They may just, if there's a new company that's starting up that's going to be a competitor, just buy them out and just kind of kill the idea to preserve their business. Or in the movie industry, now since a lot of movies are funded by large corporations, they just want to go with the surefire, the Marvel movie. That's why you keep getting like the same types of movies over and over, because the the firms that are now financing movies just care about the return, and they're not necessarily doing it for taking a risk, and like doing something for the art. It's just a straight financial calculation, and maybe you lose something through that process. And then the impact on human communities and other institutions. One of the kind of underpinnings of this society, like this system of market capitalism, is the individual choice, consumer choice. So uh, it isolates a person. Okay, they start, and especially with the rising of material levels and incomes for people, you stop relying on others. You don't need your family. You don't need your community. You can earn a living on your own. You can live in your own apartment. You can live in your own house. You stop needing other people and other kinds of support structures, because the economy is delivering to you a material standard that you can kind of achieve on your by your own efforts. And so this starts undermining maybe some of the other communities, church communities, religious communities, labor unions. There's other human institutions that exist and ways of people organizing with each other that may fall apart because people don't need each other as much anymore. Or they're just focused on uh, their own well-being, okay, which is good and bad. There's a trade-off here. Again, this whole list is trying to figure out what the drawbacks are, and I think we kind of have talked a lot about the benefits, efficient allocation of resources, high living standard, etc. But we also, again, need to be honest about how this system can negatively impact people.